I want to say good afternoon to those of you who are here in New York with us, and good morning to those of you who are streaming live from as far away as California. My name is Ronald White. I'm the Executive Director for Grantmakers for Children, Youth, and Families, and I want to welcome you all to this Ripple Effects, DACA's Impact on Dreamers and Their Families. Today's program is hosted by Philanthropy New York. I want to thank Philanthropy New York for that. And co-sponsored by Grantmakers concerned with immigrants and refugees and Grantmakers for Children, Youth, and Families. Each of our organizations has a stake in responding to Grantmakers' interest in deferred action for childhood arrivals, or what's popularly known as DACA. That's the program that provides temporary protection from deportation and work authorization to undocumented youth and young adults. These, especially for those who are known as dreamers or who were child immigrants. For Grantmakers for Children, Youth, and Families, DACA represents an important opportunity for funding children, youth, and family issues. The demography impels us, really, to support immigrants and their families if we are to be really a holistically civil society. Two statistics. First, in 2010, 12.9% of the US population, it's about 13%, was comprised of immigrants. Secondly, children in immigrant families represented nearly a quarter, 24%, of all children in the US. We cannot be serious about children and families unless we include immigrants. While in the past, many immigrants were single men or women, today, most are a mix of immigration status. So funding that benefits immigrant families often reaches US citizen children, as well as youth and parents who have legal permanent status, the undocumented, and those who have naturalized to become US citizens. Immigrant families' strengths and needs are for the most part consistent with those of other families in the US, as one would expect. So funders who make grants in the area of children, youth, and families need simply apply an immigrant lens in order to be effective in their grant making. As we're here about today, deferred action for childhood arrivals directly benefits younger immigrants and also offers indirect benefits to their parents, siblings, and children. Some of these benefits were anticipated and some were a happy surprise. Early funders have mainly made grants for legal assistance, outreach, and involvement of dreamers, but many are now considering how to increase their investments in financial assistance for asset building, education, and civic engagement. These are all strategies for strengthening children, youth, and families. And I look forward with learning with you today, and with you joining us afar about these grant-making opportunities. It's now my pleasure to turn this over to Maria Mottola, the Executive Director of the New York Foundation, who has kindly agreed to moderate. Sean Moorhead of the New York Community Trust was originally slated for this role, but has a scheduling conflict, and so we're happy to welcome Maria. Maria is extremely knowledgeable about DACA and its impact through her foundation's grant making, and also as a member of the Fund for New Citizens. Thank you, Maria, for stepping in as moderator.
Thank you, Ron. So I wanted, first of all, nobody can really be a good relief pitcher or as good a relief pitcher as the star pitcher, so we are sorry that Sean's not with us. But the New York Foundation is actually a member of the Fund for New Citizens, so if folks have some questions, or later on we're going to have some time to talk about that work here in New York, which is hosted by the New York Community Trust. I wanted to just start actually with a little story that our knowledge of DACA actually comes, as Ron said, through our grant making, but maybe more interestingly, the summer that deferred action was passed, the New York Foundation was excited to host a Dreamer through a program that United We Dream has, which asks nonprofits and foundations to agree to have a young person be there with them as an intern for the summer. And some of you may have know Yenny, who was working at Make the Road New York and has been profiled in the national press as one of the early DACA applicants. And so what's great to know about DACA is that we were actually with her when everything was unfolding, and she was finding out that for the first time in her life, for her family, she would be able to apply. And that sort of gives me, I feel, a feeling, a sense of this work that's very concrete, because watching her go through the process and now be a youth leader at Make the Road New York, helping hundreds and hundreds of other young people file their applications, has been just a real honor to have been part of her story. And she was really, for those of you who are interested in philanthropy, the experience of hosting a young person who's a dreamer that summer was really just a great experience for all of us at New York Foundation. So we are going to actually start by asking those who are in the room to just briefly introduce yourselves and the name of your institution. And maybe if you just very quickly want to say whether or not your foundation does any funding in this area, that would be helpful. So can we start that end?
My name is also Roberto. Justice in the Work Foundation.
I'm again, we're national funding intermediary, and we're making our second round of grants for assistance with DACA processing by field groups outside of major metropolitan areas to complement GSER's funding. So we're doing that this month.
Great.
We're working with our members in 6 states, 7 sites to get funding out to the ground. Get funding out to the ground to support DACA implementation.
And again, Ron White with Grantmakers for Children, Youth, and Families.
And I'm Natasha Blaine, Associate Director of Grantmakers for Children, Youth, and Families.
Great. We're going to, go over here, sorry.
And I'm Cathie from the most of our funding has been focused on providing support to immigrant youth to be a part of the process, allowing dreamers to help facilitate a lot of the large outreach and training that happens. We've also supported the work that these are in I was trained to be a program officer with the Illinois Foundation, and over the past year, we've had a lot of portfolios supporting DACA implementation nationally for the GSER's work and immigration office, as well as a
Great. Great.
I'm Owens. I'm the Vice President of Programs for the National Federation of Community Development Credit Unions. Our CEO actually was one of your presenters on the panel today. In terms of our credit unions, we have over 200 credit unions nationally who have worked on DACA, citizenship, and other loans to immigrants.
Great.
And I'm Lauren Hudson, and I'm a fellow at the National Federation of Community Development Credit Union.
Welcome. Yes.
Hello, my name is Sarah Logan. I'm the co-director at New Economy Project. And we work with GSER, the Immigration Coalition, and 2 members of the National Federation of Community Development Credit Unions, the Lower Side of People, the cooperative federal credit union, in all names, to create a Dreamer Loan Fund.
Hi, everyone. Walter, I represent
Great. And anybody, do you want to say who you are?
Sure, I'm Tanya Herbert. I'm the Women Dream Lifetime Foundation, which is located down in Baltimore. And I wasn't sure what the crew was, but we have been involved in some DACA efforts, through the Fund for the Citizens, and also in Maryland, through Casa Maryland.
Great. Thank you, everybody. And I'm the speakers, oh, sorry.
Oh, it's fine. My name's Liz. I'm the DACA outreach coordinator at the New York Immigration Coalition.
Oh, great. Okay. We're going to have the speakers, will be introduced when they're speaking. But also just to let people know, this is being live streamed, so there are folks who are watching this who are not in the room with us. I don't know if we know how many, but some number. Yeah, it's okay. Doesn't matter. But just so everybody's aware, we're being watched. So we have a lot of really important information to cover today, and I think given everybody's experience in funding this area, I think people will have a lot to say. So the bios of the speakers are in your packet. I will introduce them as they speak, but for the details about their work, you can check the packet. And then there are other things in the packet. I know I went on GSER's website before coming here and saw the great resources that are up there that talk about this work and how it's funded in other places, and important facts and figures that program staff are always looking for at the last minute before their board meetings. All that's up there. So I would encourage you to look in your packets. Oh, 17 people are watching everything we do. So 18 now, because I said that. Okay. Yeah, maybe we don't want that number up now. It starts to go down as Steve's speaking. So we have a terrific panel today. We have Roberto Gonzales, who's an assistant professor at Harvard University, who's going to talk to us about some research. Cathie, who's the CEO of the Federation of Community Development Credit Unions, and Steve Choi, who is the executive director of the local New York Immigration Coalition. So I think we have a lot of important stories to hear, so we're going to start with Roberto.
Thank you, Maria. And special thanks to Philanthropy New York, GSER, and Grantmakers for Children, Youth, and Families. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm super excited to be sharing what is data that is really, really brand new. We just ran this data, and this is the first audience that will be getting this data. So I'm excited to be here and looking forward to this conversation. So a little bit of context here. Over the last 2 to 3 decades, changes in our immigration policy, most notably enforcement, have altered the complexity of migration and settlement in the United States. As a result, what we saw through the 1990s and the early part of the 2000s was a growing trend towards settlement. Ron alluded to this in his remarks earlier, but what we have now, whereas before migrants were coming to the U.S. to work, leaving families in their country of origin. It became a lot more costly, a lot more difficult, and a lot more dangerous to cross, and so migrants started sending for their families. What we have today is the largest number of settled people living in undocumented residency. And as a result, we have a large group of children, the first time in the history of this country in great numbers, that are growing up in the United States without legal status. So these young people represent not only unintended consequences of our border policy, but it could be argued they are invisible victims of our immigration restriction. So what we know, over the last 10 years, I've been doing research on this very question of what happens to these children without legal status as they make critical transitions through adolescence and young adulthood. For these young people, transitioning from the protected status of K through 12 schools and into an adult life of blocked access and barriers. Indeed, growing up for these young people is hard to do. So what we know is that because of these conflicting circumstances from the protection and safety of K through 12 schools to an adult world where everyday life is narrowly circumscribed, that these young people have to relearn and have to retool, what I've called learning to be illegal. Everyday life is rife with barriers, exclusions, hurdles, and really creates difficulties for these young people navigating their everyday worlds. We've also seen in the long term that the effects of exclusion, of stigma, of constant worry take their toll over time. And so many of the young people that I've interviewed over the last several years have reported incidents of strained mental health and well-being. And so this is a really important problem that people are now starting to pay attention to. And then finally, this group is not a homogeneous group. Right? Our research really shows that these young people are experiencing undocumented status and these transitions through adulthood differently. And very importantly, local context matters. So what happens in school, the participation of community organizations, and institutions within the community importantly mediate the status. So moving on to DACA, June 15th, 2002, our president announced a change in his enforcement policy. This 2012, did I say 2002? A change in his enforcement policy, it would be wonderful. And announced this Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. To date, a little more than 550,000 young people have applied. The program was implemented in August 15th of 2012. Nearly a year later, we launched our national undocumented research project. This is a 5-year study to explore the impacts of widened access through DACA. This project, importantly, is funded by the MacArthur Foundation that's funding the bulk of the project. We're also doing some California-specific efforts that have been funded by Irvine Foundation and the Heising Simons Foundation. This effort is a very large team effort that involves researchers who are documented, who are community organizers, and who are researchers throughout the country. We've been involved over the last several months in outreach efforts, and in the 1st of July launched this survey, myself with in collaboration with Veronica Terriquez of USC. I will talk a little bit later about what we hope to do in the subsequent years. We'll move from this national survey to follow up in-depth qualitative work in about 6 states. We're targeting Arizona, Florida, California, Georgia, New York, and Illinois. What we want to do is to look at the ways in which local contexts mediate undocumented status. It's one, the experience of being undocumented growing up in New York City are qualitatively different than being undocumented and growing up in rural Georgia. And we want to try to tease out some of these local contexts and the effects that they're having on DACA recipients. Yeah, Arizona, California, Florida, Georgia, New York, and Illinois. We've picked this group because they represent very different contexts. So I want to talk a little bit about our sample. In the last several months since the survey launched in July 1, almost 2,500 DACA eligible young adults have taken the survey. Of those who've taken the survey, the overwhelming number has DACA. So what I'm presenting today is largely a picture of those who've received DACA. Another 10% has not received DACA. About 27% of those have applied, but we're still waiting at the time of the survey. We have a little bit more women than men. The majority is Latino. We oversampled for Asian Americans and have close to 13% Asian Americans. A little better than 9% white, black, and other. 2/3 of the sample is low income. 3/4 report living in a two-parent household. 65% still live at home, and 10% have their own children. In terms of geography, Mexico, if you look at some of the numbers, Audrey Singer and Tom Wong and others who looked at USCIS data, so Mexicans are a little undercounted in this sample. Central Americans 10%, Asian Pacific Islanders almost 15%. The vast majority, because of our California efforts, come from the West. 16% from the Midwest, 17% from the Northeast, and excitingly, almost 21% from the South. We know very little about Dreamers in the South, and so this is really important to have this data. So in terms of schooling, 1/3 of our sample has a high school diploma or less. 1/3 has some college. It's important to note that 44% of that some college group has stopped out of college, meaning that they started college and they've left. This has implications for what DACA doesn't provide in terms of financial aid and other financial resources, but we can get to later. And 1/3 has a college degree, from associates all the way up to professional degrees. 83% of these young adults who've taken the survey have worked at some point in their lives. 65% of them are currently employed. 36% have more than one job currently. And 37% have health insurance. And this is something that we're going to want to tease out in the qualitative interviews. We suspect a lot of these young people have health insurance through school. But some are actually reporting that their employers are providing health insurance. And so this is turning out to be one of those surprises that Ron mentioned. This is a group, so across all categories of our sample from the very highly educated through those who didn't finish high school. On average, this is a group that is very civically and community active. And this again, I want to emphasize this. We've known about dreamers and high achievers being very civically active, but what we're finding is that across the board, this is a group that is very active in their community. So if you look at the numbers, these young men and women have volunteered with political organizations at high levels, with educational organizations, with health organizations, with immigration organizations, and with religious organizations. In terms of leadership, 57% of our sample has held a leadership position. 51% are in a decision-making capacity. High numbers of our respondents have participated in outreach, worked in their communities, engaged politically online, attended rallies or protests, encouraged voters in their communities to support particular candidates, and have politically engaged parents. Overwhelming 34% have politically engaged parents. In terms of their attitudes, these young men and women strongly care about community issues. They strongly feel that they can make a difference. They feel strongly connected to others working to improve society, and they believe strongly that they can affect what government does. They strongly disagree that everyone has an equal chance. This is not surprising given their own experience. And they strongly disagree that racial discrimination is not a problem in the U.S. So moving on to our key findings, I'm going to run through these, and I'm happy to pick up any questions later. But I want to make sure that we get through these. This is a really important finding for those of you who are doing work with applications and any kind of outreach for DACA. 92% of this sample reported that they've received help filling out DACA paperwork. Large numbers from legal clinics, community organizations, schools, religious organizations, and others. But these young people have sought out help. And the extent to which it's been there within their communities, it's really moved a lot of these young people through the DACA process. We've been piloting some research, interviewing community-based organizations that are doing work with DACA around the country and are hoping to launch a larger project, comparative project. But very quickly, what some of the service providers told us was that the sudden start of DACA put strain on agencies. A very quick flood of applications and the scramble to shore up outreach were early issues that many people caught up to, but nevertheless presented some challenges. It led many of the people that we've talked to turn away complex cases. And this is something that we're now circling back to as we're realizing that there's a huge chunk that hasn't applied. And so as applications have slowed down, many of these service providers across the country are now turning to hard-to-reach groups. These organizations are both a vehicle for DACA implementation and a constraint limiting its reach. To the extent that these organizations are well-staffed, well-prepared, and able to handle applications, the young people within their communities are moving through. But the extent to which they have challenges really places barriers on young people trying to receive DACA. So underscoring the point that trust and the reputation of organizations are critical within communities. So changes since DACA. A few months ago, with Immigration Policy Center, we issued a brief on some of these findings. But high numbers have received driver's licenses, bank accounts, credit cards, internships, new jobs, increased earnings, and healthcare. I want to talk a little bit. We ran some regressions, and I'd be happy to talk to researchers who want to know a little bit more about that. But beyond kind of these really positive numbers, we know who is benefiting the most. So clearly, respondents who participated in community-based and immigrant rights organizations are most likely to reap the benefits of DACA. They're 1.27 times more likely to obtain a new job. They're 1.22 times likely to increase their earnings, and 2.6 times more likely to obtain an internship. So these young people that belong to these organizations are much likely to possess social networks, as well as the know-how to get jobs, to be able to secure jobs. They also may be highly motivated individuals who've learned how to advocate for themselves. The returns on education are really important and sharp and positive. Educational attainment among our respondents correlates strongly and positively with the likelihood of reaping the economic and other benefits of DACA. So those who've attended college and community and four-year colleges are the most likely to have received a new job and increased their earnings compared to those who have not gone to college. These benefits appear to be the greatest for those who've already received their bachelor's degree. So DACA has benefits, and DACA is benefiting at greater levels those who are highly educated. Family SES, this is something also that is not a big surprise, but not something that we've had data on before. Those who come from higher SES backgrounds, families who have resources, are more likely than their less privileged counterparts to obtain internships and bank accounts. If we think about struggling families, tight budgets, certainly maybe preventing some youth from accessing resources, as those from low income backgrounds are less likely to obtain a driver's license and health care.
Yeah, SBS.
Oh, socioeconomic status. So income, wealth, etc. Sorry. Given the high number of Mexicans who have received DACA, this finding is troubling. There is an underutilization by Mexicans. Our results suggest that Mexicans are accessing fewer resources than other groups. They're less likely to obtain new jobs. They're less likely to increase their earnings. They're less likely to obtain internships. They're less likely to obtain bank accounts, to obtain their first credit cards, and to receive health care. There's no significant difference in their likelihood to receive driver's licenses. This may be due to our large numbers on the West Coast, but we think also the driver's license issue is one that is a universal benefit. Gender and age, men are more likely than women to obtain credit cards. Age is negatively associated with opening first bank account and obtaining a license, so that what we're saying is that younger DACA recipients are more likely to seek out these benefits. Age is also positively correlated with obtaining a driver's license and obtaining health care. So the older you are, the more responsibilities you have. 64% of our respondents are less afraid of law enforcement. 65% are less afraid of being deported. These are huge numbers, and beyond the material benefits of DACA, the ability to lead everyday lives without the stress and worry is really critical. So we've got a small group of young respondents who have not applied to DACA. These are disconnected dreamers, and we certainly want to enlarge the sample to understand more. But these young people very generally come from both rural and urban areas. On average, they've received less schooling, they work more, they have less trust in adults, they're more likely to be on their own, and more likely to have children. For these young people, almost 45% of them have not applied because they can't afford DACA. Many others are missing paperwork, haven't applied because of legal concerns, they don't trust government, they don't know how to apply, a small number because of educational requirements, small number because they've left the U.S., and about 30% of them are waiting for better options. So many of the things that we've known before, it's nice to have some of these numbers. Healthcare, many of these young people continue to be stressed out, nervous, hopeless, a range of feelings, feel like everything is an effort most of the time. Many of them are worried about being deported. 11% of them have been detained at some point, and a large number of them know somebody, including family members, that have been deported. So if immigration reform would pass, this really shows that these young people belong to families and communities. 87% of family members could benefit. Their mom 73%, father 61, siblings 54, other family. I'm out of time, but in the Q&A I'd be happy to talk about some of the implications, because I think that there's some really important policy and practice implications here. Thank you.
Thank you. That was so thorough. And we will have time for questions after folks finish. Did somebody, can you just introduce yourself? Someone new came in.
Hi, everyone.
Welcome, Archana. So Cathie, I think you're next.
Okay. Is this the button you push? Thank you very much. And my name is Cathie Mahon. I'm sort of going to be addressing some of the concepts that came out in Roberto's presentation, and specifically, to the extent to which Roberto's research has pointed to challenges for immigrants from lower incomes to be able to access banking, healthcare, and specifically the extent to which that may be inhibiting folks from being able to access DACA. So one of the things that we'll be talking about in my presentation is ways that we have through community development credit unions, been partnering with organizations that are providing the DACA assistance to be able to provide access to financing. Quickly, just the National Federation, it's a national CDFI intermediary membership organization for credit unions, building financial security for low and moderate income Americans. Our mission is to help low and moderate income people and communities achieve financial independence through credit unions. I'm going to take just a second and ask you all to bear with me, because I do think, since so much of this piece will be about figuring out strategies to help organizations on the ground partner up with providers of safe and affordable financing, I thought it might be helpful to do a little credit union primer, just so folks kind of know a little bit about credit unions, how they work, why we think they're sort of a unique and a really opportune solution for organizations on the ground to partner with. But also some of the constraints that might be just good to know about and have in mind. So credit unions really were established as alternative to traditional banks to provide financial services to the working class. That was sort of defined in the original Credit Union Act back in the 30s. They're cooperative owned and controlled financial institutions. Deposits are shares, and so depositors are shareholders or members. And that's sort of, we really believe that's sort of an empowering part of what we do, is we not only go into, we work in low-income communities to provide services, but really to provide a pathway towards empowerment, where people are owning and controlling the resources and recycling and revolving those resources within the community. One member, one vote. So when you join a credit union, you become a shareholder and a voter, and you elect your board of directors. Credit unions have no outside stockholders, so after reserves are set aside, earnings are returned to members in the form of dividends on savings, lower loan rates, or additional supportive services. And they serve, I think this is an important one just to know, credit unions serve groups of members who have a common bond. That may mean, in some cases for credit unions, that might mean it's a select employee group. So you probably are familiar with credit unions that are linked to specific employers. It may mean they're a community-based credit union, so it's sort of designed and organized to serve a specific geography. Or more and more, what we're finding in our membership and across the board is some kind of combination. So a lot of times you'll have credit unions that serve sort of what we call now a multiple common bond. So they may serve specific targeted geographies, but also be able to have associational relationships with nonprofits that help the clients of those nonprofits be able to access the credit union by virtue of that. And so that becomes a neat pathway to deal with. How do you get people into the credit unions if there's not a designated field of membership or common bond already in place? The credit unions that we work with at the Federation are community development credit unions. That's a term that was coined back in the 70s to sort of identify those credit unions within the broader industry that see their role as having a primary mission of serving low-income communities and underserved populations. So it's a sort of self-designated, it's a self-designation. Generally, almost all of our members actually also have official designations of a low-income designation status, which comes from the regulator. That means that the majority of their members are in fact low-income individuals and families. There's also many of our members are increasingly obtaining the certification of a community development financial institution, or CDFI. So talking about the need, and I believe the prior presentation really sort of queued it up perfectly. There is a high need, particularly around foreign-born citizens without documented status of being unbanked. And generally, we'll talk a little bit about, some of the procedures in place in being able to access things like basic bank accounts often present really significant impediments for people who are not documented to be able to get into and even be able to open an account. And 28.9% are underbanked. At 52 million, Hispanics represent 16.7 of the total U.S. population. 20% are unbanked and about 28.6 are underbanked. So, for among community development credit unions, a lot of what our members really strive to do is to make sure that they're able to help folks of all, all the folks in their community to be able to access their services. They've embraced what we consider immigrant-friendly policies and procedures, and this is just an important thing to note. Specifically, community development credit unions, and we've spent a lot of time at the Federation sort of educating our folks about how to put policies in place that enable them to open accounts for folks who do not have Social Security numbers. And so in a lot of cases, credit unions will either be ITIN, individual taxpayer identification number, IRS acceptance agents, so they will help people be able to obtain an ITIN number that would enable them to open an account, or they will work closely with others who are ITIN acceptance agents, and they will be able to help people be able to obtain that number so they may open and maintain an interest-bearing account and still be able to report that income for the purposes of taxes. Credit unions accept a wide range of identification that is sort of non-traditional and enables people to be able to open accounts with, identifying and proving their identification. So under the U.S. Patriot Act, there's a lot of requirements that financial institutions identify that if an account holder is who they say they are. And it is widely known in practice, particularly among credit unions, that things like consular IDs and passports are valid forms of identification that would enable people to open accounts. Also, I'll just say quickly before, is just that credit unions really look towards developing bilingual and multilingual services, consistent delivery of services throughout their branches, low and transparent costs. Increasingly, we're doing quite a bit around financial counseling and coaching, either directly or through community and nonprofit partners. And I think that's sort of an important part of any sort of programmatic piece, is to make sure that we're not just helping people open accounts or access a specific product, but that we're using those as sort of teachable moments or transformative moments in which we can help people access a wide range of asset building products and services. Oopsies. We'll talk, so there's a range of targeted products and services that have been developed around credit building, ITIN lending, affordable home ownership, small business and microenterprise, and of citizenship lending. But now to get to the Dreamer loan pilots, and specifically, there are probably about 12 to 15 formal established loan programs around the country that in which credit unions have teamed up with community organizations that are providing the supportive work to get people filing DACA applications, and where the credit unions come in offering loans to be able to afford that application fee. CDCs from New York to California have launched these microloans. Sarah Ludwig here can talk a little bit in depth about one of the programs. But we have numerous credit unions around the country that are getting involved, and this year we've been doing a major outreach and education efforts to get as many as possible. Across the board, you'll see a number of credit unions that offer general loan products, but what we really want to do is offer these targeted loan products that sort of meet the population's needs. Generally, the product terms, small dollar loans, less than $500 to go towards the application fee. They're generally 6 to 12 months. The critical piece here is flexible underwriting criteria and rapid approvals. That's fundamental and essential to getting these loans out the door and making these partnerships happen. That generally means no credit checks. Sometimes it also means no or very low expectations of documented income. And that's something that under underwriting is an important shift. The structure of the loan program, oftentimes in order to have these very flexible underwriting criteria, there's loan loss reserves that enable credit unions to take greater flexibility. Some of the loan programs are 100% reserved. Others have internally allocated resources while we're testing the loss rates. The loss rates to date have been very, very low, but it's still very, very early on. So as we're testing these loss rates, a lot of credit unions are either raising outside capital or identifying internal resources to allow them to be able to make these really flexible, rapid turnaround loans in such a way that's not going to sink the institution and enable them to test out what is the right rate and the right way to be structuring that. Again, losses have been extremely limited, repayment rates extraordinarily high, but still more data is needed to really figure out the right level of cushion. And some of these early on pilots have been providing that data, and we're continuing to sort of build and evaluate those pieces of it. Around implementation, I think the critical pieces really are that there has to be a strong partnership between the credit union and the immigrant and legal services organizations. The partner organizations provide the support with the DACA application and can kind of queue up that application to the credit union to be able to rapidly get that loan turned around. The relationship and the connection to the credit union really matters, understanding and sort of having on the ground sort of a process in place that makes it as easiest as possible for the applicant to get from point A to point B and be able to access the financing and finish their application as fast and as smoothly as possible. The staging, and I would just lastly say, you know, to date, the staging of the implementation has sort of affected take-up. So we've been seeing sort of fits and starts and take-up, and we can talk a little bit in the Q&A about where you see sort of more, you know, steady flows and where there's been sort of some fits and starts. So, you know, I think a key piece that in the early pilots that has been essential is for the most part in the early pilots, there has been some funding sources that have come in the source of loan loss reserves. We don't know that those necessarily always have to be at the 100% level, but certainly in these early stages to have a significant cushion enables the credit union to just keep the regulators at bay as they really experiment with being innovative and flexible. The operational support for the credit union, and maybe even more important for those nonprofit partners to be able to do this work and make that connection on the ground, I think is really important. Investing in this sort of smoother linkages between the partners, thinking about, you know, ultimately thinking about the technology that might be needed in terms of online platforms, remote account opening procedures, ways to facilitate and limit the number of steps that people have to go through to get from point A to point B. Learning networks, best practice sharing. There's a lot to be learned. There's a lot of interest in sort of sharing. We've been convening some of our more innovative members around this topic of conversations, and all they want is more and more and more of being able to hear from each other. I feel like getting everybody in the same room frequently in order to continue this sharing will be really essential. So I'll leave it at that. Advocacy is always an important area for support.
Cathie, thank you. So we heard from Roberto earlier about the important role that community-based organizations play in this work, and also that the interesting correlation between being politically and civically involved, you know, and caring about community issues. That's been true of some of the youth who have been who've received DACA. And so where all that expertise sits is actually in many parts of the country in CBOs who have formed umbrella organizations like the New York Immigration Coalition. And Steve's going to talk to us a little bit about their work here locally.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve Choi. I'm the Executive Director of the New York Immigration Coalition. We are an umbrella policy and advocacy group for nearly 200 member institutions across the state. Yeah, I'm going to talk actually about one specific initiative that we actually are in the middle of launching. So a lot of this is kind of playing out as we speak. Apologies on the title. I think I went a little overboard on the alliteration there. It seemed really good at 11 o'clock at night, which is when I wrote. Okay, so this is what I'm going to talk about today. Number one, DACA facts. Who has enrolled? The facts and the data are actually really critical and the reason why we launched this initiative. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Next, the New York City's DACA initiative, how does it work? I'll talk about how it was created, how it's been implemented, and about some of the lessons that we've learned during the process. I do want to give a little bit of time to talk about legalization because I think it's important. I think, and I'll just give you a sneak preview, I think that there's a good chance that we will see some sort of mass legalization coming in the next couple of years. May not be this year, but what does DACA have to tell us about that, and how can we see some of the efforts, particularly the city initiative? I'll talk briefly about that. And then, of course, how you can help beyond simply giving us money. I have more specifics on that. So DACA facts, I think we all kind of know about this. I think the important thing here is about the educational requirement. And that's actually something that came about and is not really well known, and I think has not been very well publicized. And basically, there is an education component that says you don't have to have a GED, you don't have to have a diploma, but if you are enrolled in a adult education, including vocational ESL, and the specifics, Betsy, our DACA outreach coordinator, can probably tell you more about that, but that is a little loophole. And so I think there are a lot of folks, as you can see, as you will see, that are eligible for this particular provision, and that's the real target of this initiative. The thing to note here on this slide is 79,000 people we estimated were eligible in New York City. And when you break that down, of course, you can see how that gets broken down there. And the thing to note for us is that bottom number right there. It's estimated 16,000 or 17,000 individuals in New York City who can become DACA eligible if they're enrolled in one of these adult education programs. This is a big number. This is a big number, and yet we found that people were just not paying enough attention to this. So this is the eligibility piece. And if we look at the actual application numbers, though, we see a different story. I think if you actually, first of all, 49% of all eligible youth are applying. That's a pretty low number. But in New York State, the number is down to 34%. So why is that number so low? Why is it that 1 out of 3 eligible people are applying? And I think Professor Gonzales went over some of the answers, whether it's a focus on dreamers, whether the fee was too high, a lack of knowledge, whether organizations weren't set up to actually provide those services. And you know what? A lot of people find that the numbers are wrong. There's a lot of controversy about these numbers. But even if you think that these numbers are a little bit off, I think it's still pretty stunning, right? Even if you think that the number of eligible people is half that, you still have a pretty significant underrepresentation of eligible folks who are actually applying. So to put things in a nutshell, the New York City Council, and I really want to give some props to Speaker Quinn. I was trying to think of a better word than props, but I want to give some recognition to City Council Speaker Quinn, because the New York Immigration Coalition, and specifically our education advocacy team, really fought hard to say we cannot forget about the other folks. Of course we have the dreamers. Of course we have these folks who are the cap and gown crowd and who are really amazing and really folks who should be highlighted. But let's not forget about these folks. I'm going to call them the hard to reach. Folks who have not met the adult education requirement, who don't have a GED, who don't have a high school diploma. We cannot forget about them. And so we did presentations for all sorts of folks, but City Council Speaker Quinn really stepped up, and she had her education policy team also step up as well. So they were able to make it happen, and then once they announced the initiative, then DYCD in New York City, the Department of Youth and Community Development, they were the ones who actually said how we're going to implement it. And so I'm going to talk about that. But make no mistake that the target population, and I think this is a really big win, City Council Speaker Quinn made no mistake that the target population of this initiative was going to be some of these hard-to-reach folks. So this is what actually happened. They made available $18 million. Baseline means that it's basically in the mayor's budget. And for folks who are not familiar with New York City, there's this budget dance that happens every year where money gets taken out, replaced. When you have a baseline, you don't have that. So you don't have that sort of budget dance. So that money is in the budget for this year and for next year. And this is how they broke it out. You can see CUNY gets $4.3 million right off the top, and then the rest of the money gets divided between this current fiscal year and then FY15, which will start in July of 2014. And the important part is the outreach. We really pushed so that there would be significant amounts of money dedicated for outreach. And so we're able to secure $800,000 for both the current fiscal year and for FY 2015. This is how it actually breaks down. There's 3 parts of the city's DACA initiative. There's adult education, outreach, and legal services. And our role really is to play a direct role in coordinating the outreach effort. And this is more of an explanation about it. For the outreach, it's important to note that we pushed to make sure that groups were included that are different from the traditional service providers, right? So we're working with day labor groups, we're working with cultural groups, we're working with groups, finance groups as well. But the thing about these groups, even though they didn't necessarily have the legal services capacity or whatnot, they did have tried and tested routes to their community. And so we felt it was absolutely critical to have them involved. Adult education, obviously they needed to be involved here because the idea was that we would get some of these folks and they would participate in an adult education class to meet that educational requirement. And then legal as well. The thing to note is that for the adult education groups, a lot of them didn't even have DACA on their radar. They didn't even know what it was. They didn't know how to make referrals and where to send their students. And on the legal side, a lot of the legal groups weren't aware of the adult education part. In fact, I would see webinars where it would just get glossed over. And they would go straight into a discussion about the criminal history without actually talking and digging into the adult education piece. So we wanted to make sure that all three of these groups were included. And this is our role in this. The NYC's role is really to provide critical support in developing educational materials, toolkits, training for all the providers as well. Realistically though, we've been working step by step with DYCD to make sure we can coordinate all the moving parts. How do the referrals work? Do they go, folks come in through outreach, do they go to adult ed first? Do they go to legal first? Do they go simultaneously? All this stuff is infrastructure that we had to work with DYCD to just make happen because there was nothing there. DYCD was basically operating from a blank slate where they said, we have $13.7 million, how are we going to spend it? So it's been a lot of work to work together with them to see exactly how this would all come about. Another key piece of this is data. And we're actually working with a couple of academics, James Bachmeyer from Temple University. We have a team of academics, somebody working at NYU, someone working with CUNY, and also with Migration Policy Institute to really get the best, finest grain data that we can because we think it's going to be critical in shaping the outreach. Where are we going to reach out to these folks? How can we reach out to them, especially this hard-to-reach population? Because by definition, they are hard to reach, and it's not that easy. They have been used to sort of living underground. So, in a nutshell, in thinking about this entire initiative, I thought there were a couple of lessons that were important for us. The first one is really the importance of data. You've got to have really accurate data. And I think the NYC's education team did a really good job in educating people about the data and making sure that everybody knew that there were an estimated 16 to 17,000 hard-to-reach individuals in New York City. So using that data and really making sure that we were emphasizing the benefits, the ramifications for each of these subgroups, not just the dreamers, but also the hard-to-reach folks. I think the data was really critical, and I also want to give recognition. I was going to say give a shout-out, but I also want to give recognition to Vicki Virgin and Joe Salvo of City Planning, who also really worked closely and hand-in-hand with us to make sure that we had the data and the estimates that allowed us to actually create the level of funding. Also, persistence in emphasizing the hard-to-reach population. Like I said before, a lot of times this population was ignored. And I think a lot of people focus on dreamers. And it became so that DACA was synonymous with dreamers. And I understand that. Dreamers are amazing. And I think they have done an amazing job in the advocacy movement to really push the immigrant rights movement. We should definitely highlight their examples, but we should also talk about the impact on the hard-to-reach folks. And for some, the impact of DACA can even be greater. This may be the first set of folks who are actually going to some sort of adult education, and they really deserve all of the same kind of attention and resources that dreamers get as well. And when you add in parental status, a lot of these folks are working and have kids themselves. The impact can be multi-generational. Understanding the political context, I'll be honest, Speaker Quinn, it was an election year, right? And so that obviously was part of the equation. But I do want to make sure that she gets credit because she was really the only one who understood that the DACA policy went beyond dreamers. It was election year and she was running, and probably this was part of her effort to shore up the immigrant vote. Sure, that's there. But I think it's important for us as organizations and as advocates to have a sophisticated understanding of how the political context works, because that's there and you can't simply avoid that. And then outreach, really pushing hard from day one. Let's face it, outreach is the red-headed stepchild when it comes to government money. You know, it's fuzzy. People say, what are the deliverables? How can I measure the impact? Folks are much more comfortable working with adult ed providers. They're more comfortable working with legal providers. And a lot of the outreach groups are small groups working with immigrant communities that a lot of times their leaders are not English proficient. And so there is this bureaucratic element as well where government officials are very comfortable working with the folks who can navigate the city contract system. But we said from day one, if you don't include the outreach, you're going to have empty classrooms. Or you're going to have classrooms with no DACA folks in them. You know, it's funny, I was talking with this Times reporter who's actually going to write an article at any point. But when we were talking about this initiative, he was actually really gung-ho about writing an article about how there's $18 million spent and no DACA people actually got helped. And I said, well, hold your horses. I think they may actually get helped. And he was very disappointed that I told him that there was nothing for him to write about on that front. I wanted to talk quickly about legalization and really the way in which we see this city initiative, and we actually want to roll some of this out on a statewide level as well. We see this as a very interesting prototype of what legalization could look like, where you have outreach providers working together with legal providers. And on a related note, we are working on this New York Immigrant Assistance Consortium. We originally thought of creating this consortium as a framework to deal with legalization. We convened this Blue Ribbon Advisory Committee to work on this. But one thing that we realized is that a lot of folks said, we need this right now. The data collection, the collaboration, the community outreach, the coordination of services to make sure you're not duplicating things, that everybody isn't trying to reinvent the wheel, the capacity building and training. This is something that we realize there's a need for right now. And so I think we see this DACA outreach initiative as a critical part of sort of a proof of concept, if you will. And so just some closing thoughts. Number one, thinking holistically. For these kinds of programs, it's important to think about the population and the community that they're serving and the groups that are working with them. For different communities, some groups are more trusted than others. And it's important to bring everybody into the fold. And they may not be the groups that provide legal services or get all the headlines, but they have trusted roots in that community. It's important to think holistically and bring in those groups. Just because they don't have an attorney on staff doesn't mean they can't be very valuable in some of this work. So that's something that's important. Also, incentivizing and supporting collaboration. Everybody knows that collaboration works. People love it on a theoretical level. But let's face it, in reality, there's many reasons why it doesn't happen. There's turf issues, there's organizational ego issues, there's money issues. You know, I mean, I think this happened with the DACA initiative as well. And so it's important to think about when you're making grants, to think about how can you incentivize collaboration in a real way. And then using data, as I mentioned before, data is really critical because it really drives a lot of what you can do and make sure the resources go in the right way. Private-public partnerships, this is a general and overused term, but I think it's really critical for these larger programs. It's not just going to be private foundations to be able to do legalization, for example. We got to think about how to work closely with the government. And then finally, in terms of leveraging private funding, I think private funding is key, and it's important to think about what role private funding can play vis-a-vis government money. And so I wanted to give a couple of specific examples. Number one, to support efforts to replicate this in areas in which you don't have robust government funding streams like $18 million. And also in thinking about capacity building for immigrant CBOs to make sure that they're ready to take advantage of these resources when they come down the pike, to provide training and such, and also to support coordination. These are things that may not necessarily have hard outcomes, but are really critical to making sure initiatives like this are a success. Do I have time to play a quick video? There's a brief video that I wanted to show. Stop.
You know, cue it, because maybe we will at some point if we end up gaining some time. Or we need a commercial break, then we'll play it.
Yeah.
So thank you all. This was a lot of great information to absorb. And just want to remind people that if you have questions and you're not actually physically here, You can still participate in the discussion using Twitter, hashtag capital P, capital N, capital Y, events with a capital E, or event, E-V-E-N-T, yes. So Walter's standing by for your questions. But for those people who are actually here, this is, I mean, I know I've jotted down a couple of questions, but I wanted to open it up to see what kinds of thoughts, observations, questions people in the room have. Nona?
You can raise your hand, so I should bring a microphone to the
Yeah.
folks following the lecture.
Hi, Monona Yin for Freedoms Fund. So none of you mentioned the so-called 10 to 20% of potential applicants who've been screened and may be eligible for more permanent forms of relief. And I've been trying to really get some reality check on whether the number is actually that high, and then what happens to those folks, because most of them actually have complex cases, and they fall out of the sort of normal processing. So it's very unclear whether, even if it's as high as 10%, that number actually goes on to obtain permanent relief. So do any of you have data or comments about that?
No data, but I think that, you know, early on, Rep. Gutierrez and others came out telling people that they shouldn't go to lawyers, they shouldn't seek help when filling out their applications. And I think that what we found is that participating in community clinics has helped a significant number. I don't know if it's as high as 10%, but it's helped a significant number of people who had cases who've been able to get U visas and other sorts of more temporary, more stable relief. And so will we get that level of data? I'm not sure. USCIS has released some of its FOIA data. Tom Wong at UC San Diego and Audrey Singer at Brookings have some of this. But what they have is real narrow slice of that USCIS data.
But oh, go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I was just going to say I've actually seen higher numbers than 10 to 20%, but it's really hard to tell. And I think that is a real concern, right? Especially when you're talking about legalization, because the way the Senate bill is written, if you apply for this RPI status, you give up all other forms of relief. That's a serious concern. And I think one of the things that was unfortunate about the DACA landscape last year was that the collaboration and the coordination wasn't incentivized. And what do I mean by that? I mean that legal groups were given money to do as many different applications as they could, and the same with community groups. So you have essentially legal groups and community groups fighting each other just to do as many basic applications. If you say legal groups, we want you to serve as many people as possible, they're going to spend all their efforts doing huge mass clinics, right? But if you say, well, you know what, maybe the community groups can work with some legal providers to do the mass applications, and then we want to incentivize legal groups to take on those harder cases, understanding that you're not going to see the same large numbers. You know, I think that would have been something that's something that I noticed as, you know, as we were coordinating some efforts last year, that didn't happen. And I think the result was that there is a real lack of understanding about some of those folks who do need more work on their cases and who need some more extensive legal assistance.
Did that sort of get at your question, or did you have a follow-up?
I have other questions.
Yeah. Okay. Hi, Liz. Oh, over there. Sorry.
Oh, it's okay, yeah, so, well, first it's opening up the microphone.
I thought Liz was asking a question, but Liz was just taking off her coat.
She was just saying
Liz.
hi.
That was a hi. Yes, go ahead. Sorry.
So I just wanted to thank you all for the very informative your presentations, and had a couple questions for Cathie, if I may. So one is, could you just speak a little bit to the uptake and what's been the scale of reach and how many people have applied and been able to receive loan funds at the pilots? And also, has there been discussion around, or what are the prospects for scaling up or expanding to other locations?
Yeah, thank you. So I'll say the implementation, it's been varied across sort of the different sites that have done it. I mean, there's the Latino Community Credit Union in North Carolina, for example, I think, is currently at 12 or 13,000 that they have been able to provide loans to folks for, specifically for DACA applications. They work directly with the Mexican consulate and a number of other providers, and really got their, sort of early on, got their, they already had very established relationships. And so I think when DACA came along, they were able to kind of hit the ground running. I think in other cases, the uptake has been depending upon at what stage of implementation, and it's been a lot lower in terms of the numbers. And I think, in many of the sites, it's probably, less than 100 loans that have actually been financed, not for reasons of denials, but really for reasons of take-up. And I think a lot of that just has to do with implementation as opposed to demand or lack thereof. But I don't know, Sarah, if you wanted to talk to the New York experience at all, just about volume and the implementation specifics.
Well, so first of all, I think we're going to rename our Humor Loan Fund the DACA Loan Fund after we stop. But there are two community college credit unions that are participating in the project that we've been doing with colleagues here, and it is small in number. There's probably a little more than 100 people who've gotten loans so far, and one thing Steve didn't, I don't think you mentioned, is that the New York City funded program has an element in it which is quite exciting, which is that New York City is actually paying people's application fees. And so legal services or groups that have funding to do legal services work in New York City through this DYCD, New York City funded program, have a piece of that to cover people's fees. So that was introduced, announced after we had laboriously constructed our loan fund here in New York. But it's one of those good problems to have if people can get their application fees paid. So that's put things kind of on hold. It's $268,000 total is my number, unless I'm transposing, and it's 286, but it's in the more than 250.
Yeah, and I think the thing to note there, I mean, we don't have a ton of knowledge, and there are some sort of bureaucratic rules. For example, each provider gets a certain amount, but once they exhaust that amount, then
Done.
Yeah, then if someone comes to them, then they have to refer that to like another legal service provider. There's
gotta
some
get out some
bureaucracy
kinks
around that I think we need to sort of work with DYCD to make sure there's clarity for everybody involved.
But I just want to add one quick thing about the way the loan fund's structured, because if this funding were ever to get exhausted, then the loan fund kicks in, or if there's people for whatever reasons want to avail themselves of a loan, is that it's a revolving loan fund with 0% interest paid out over 12 months in equal payments. And the thing that's really exciting for us, and we work very closely with GSER in constructing it and with some of the credit unions and the New York Immigration Coalition, is that you get an account at a community development credit union as part of the deal, and then you also, through the funding that we got, end up with $25 in your account at the end after you've successfully paid off the loan. So there's an economic inclusion, financial justice element that's really built in above and beyond the DACA, getting access to the DACA relief.
And that's, I think, from the credit union point of view, DACA can be a real opportunity to make these linkages and be able to make these connections happen. But it's the beginning of hopefully a lifelong connectivity with safe and affordable, responsible products along the way. So going to the car loans, the education loans, the eventually home mortgage loans, in which people can really kind of grow through the credit union. And just to answer quickly your second question about moving to more sites, we're working now based on some of the early experiences with both the DACA loan programs and the citizenship loan programs that a number of credit unions have also implemented, to really try to build this out to be a broader array of kind of legalization lending options, and using this moment to really make these connections start happening on the ground in targeted locations. So for example, we'll be working with GSER in 2014 to take this to other regions, and actually the Northwest is one of the regions that we're going to be focusing on, but basically spending the time to make those kind of connections happen on the ground so that we can be building that sort of infrastructure of referral and connectivity to be, sort of regardless of, what the future holds for the next set of legalization opportunities, we can hopefully have a sort of a much better starting point as a result of some of these great early lessons learned.
Cathie, I don't know if you know this, but Sarah and I were talking at a statewide convening on immigrants and economic contributions, and we were like, hey, what if we created a New York State immigrant credit union? And Sarah said, well, you're going to have to talk to Cathie. So we will be having a discussion.
That's great. I think logistically what we have to do now is, am I right, is to allow the people who are live streaming us to sign off and begin their own local conversations. Is that correct?
That's correct.
But first we wanted Darren to maybe say a few words on behalf of GSER.
We'll just sum up all of this. So I'll do that in like 2 minutes. So since folks, I need a microphone. So thank you, panelists, for really informative information. So I was just asked to quickly sum up the key points of the program, and I hope that everyone leaves away from this meeting with the notion that DACA is both a critical need and also a huge funding opportunity. Whether you fund children, youth, or families issues, whether you're interested in asset building, and I love that chart, Roberto, about the impact of DACA, getting jobs, driver's licenses, and also having diminished fear really improves the quality of life for these dreamers and having, impact on their community and families as well. Obviously, there's a lot of challenges that lie ahead. We also did a little survey of our funding collaborative members, and what we learned there, it resonates well with what Steve said, that we really need to focus in on outreach and services to hard-to-reach populations. This connects to what Roberto said too, about 92% having sought help at a community organization or legal services organization. So that's a really critical area for funders to think about. Obviously, increasing access to DACA loans would be very critical. 45%, I think, according to your survey, said that the fees were a huge barrier, and we've seen this, across the country from other studies as well. And I think for folks interested in education, the education and training opportunities are an area that's really huge. And that little loophole you talked about, Steve, with the ESL is really critical. And we had a smaller meeting yesterday with funders to talk about, how we might be able to look at that as a funding opportunity, not just to help DACA recipients, but also to start building the infrastructure for possible legalization coming down the line. I won't say a timeline. You said a couple of years. I'm not even going to say anything. Monona, you talked about the permanent forms of relief and the 10 to 20%. When we talk to our funding collaboratives around the country, they, in year 2 of funding, are really going to emphasize screening for these permanent remedies and also services to help folks access these remedies. And then I think finally data and advocacy, like you said, are really, really critical. One thing I wanted to mention that GSER is going to be doing with the Migration Policy Institute is a little study looking at the education piece. Who are, the dreamers who are eligible except for the educational requirements, and what are the pathways to get them documented. And Steve's point about leveraging funding, I think, is really critical. And you guys in New York here have a golden opportunity to participate with the Fund for New Citizens. Blaustein and New York Foundation are part of that. And I would encourage you to contact Sean. Her colleague is here as well. And for folks in other parts of the country, Walter and I are available if you're interested in thinking about how to partner with other foundations. on funding DACA. And I think that at this point is when I'm supposed to say the live stream is going to conclude. And evidently there's going to be discussions here, as well as discussions in other sites, these mysterious sites around the country, with the other 19 people who are on the line. Watching us. So, but anyway, thank you so much, Maria, for moderating, Roberto for sharing your study, Cathie for the exciting work you're doing with credit unions, and Steve for explaining the $18 million and other things as well.
Great.